The morning my husband told me he'd been in love with someone else for 8 months, I was sitting in my own clinic at 6:52 in the morning with a patient file open on my desk and a cup of gas station coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago because I'd gotten absorbed in the billing notes from the week before. That detail matters. That is exactly the kind of woman I am and have always been. The kind who shows up before everyone else, who finds the billing discrepancy nobody else caught, who drinks the cold coffee anyway because stopping to reheat it feels like a waste of 4 minutes. My husband walked through the front door of Renewal Physical Therapy at 6:53, and the first thing I thought was that something must be wrong. He never came to the clinic without calling first. He said the smell of the place bothered him. The disinfectant and the gym rubber mats, which I had always found slightly funny, given that the clinic paid for his truck payment, his phone bill, and the mortgage on the house we'd bought together in Scottsdale 18 months earlier. He sat down in one of the waiting room chairs, the gray fabric ones I'd ordered from a medical supply catalog when I opened this location, and he put his hands on his knees and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something. He said we'd grown apart. He said he'd been unhappy for longer than he knew how to explain. He said there was someone else. He said she was uncomplicated. That was the word he used. Uncomplicated. And I want you to understand what it felt like to hear that word from a man who had been living on an uncomplicated paycheck he did not earn. I smiled at him. I did. I felt the corners of my mouth go up and I said, "I appreciate you telling me." And then I excused myself, walked back to my desk, and called my office manager. "Kendall," I said, "I need you to do 3 things when you come in this morning. Cancel Julian's card access in the billing system. Call Douglas Keene's office and tell them we're moving forward. And call the locksmith. They have our home address on file from when we changed the garage code last spring." "Already?" she said. "Already," I said. "I'll explain when you're here." I hung up. I picked up the cold coffee. I took a sip. And I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Tucson with her parents, who worked the Saturday morning shift at the restaurant, where her mother managed the front of house, and her father ran the line. Looks like, who had understood since she was maybe 12 years old that money was not something you took for granted and people were not always who they appeared to be at first. She had built something worth protecting, and she was not going to lose it because a man decided that uncomplicated was something she was not. But you need to understand who I was before that morning and who my husband had quietly always been. Because the ending of this story only makes sense if you understand the beginning. I grew up in Tucson, oldest of 2 kids. My parents had come from Somalia before I was born, legally through the long and expensive process that took 4 years and most of their savings. My mother worked front of house at a Mexican restaurant called El Portal for 22 years. My father was a line cook there for the first 15, then a prep cook at a hotel downtown before his knees gave out. We were not poor in the way people imagine poverty. We ate. We had a car. I had new shoes when I needed them and used ones when I didn't. But money sat at the center of every decision, every conversation, every quiet argument my parents had behind their bedroom door when they thought I was asleep. There was a permanence to financial stress in that apartment that I internalized before I had words for it. I decided at 14 that I was not going to feel that way for the rest of my life. Not from any dramatic moment, just a slow, private determination that hardened like something cooling. I got a merit scholarship to the University of Arizona. I earned my doctorate in physical therapy at 26. I worked at Banner Health for 3 years, covered 2 clinic sites, and put away everything I could. When I was 29, I took out an SBA loan for $15,000, found a 1,200 square foot retail space in Tempe that a failed yoga studio had vacated, and opened Renewal Physical Therapy. I had a reception desk I bought used off Facebook Marketplace, a second-hand treatment table, a laptop, and a scheduling software subscription that cost $42 a month. By the time I turned 32, I had 3 locations, 18 full, and part-time staff, annual revenue just over $1.2 million, and a business my accountant had valued at approximately $2.8 million. I still drove the same Subaru Outback I'd bought used at 28. I got my nails done every few weeks at the place, near the second location that charged $32. I did not think of money as something to display. I thought of it as something you build and then protect. I met my husband at a friend's cookout the summer of 2019. He was finishing up a kitchen remodel for the host, showed up still wearing his work clothes, a little sawdust on his forearm, apologized for being late. He was 32. He ran a small general contracting operation, mostly residential renovations, a few commercial jobs when he could land them. He was warm and funny without trying too hard. On the drive home that night, my friend told me he'd kept asking about me, and I said I'd noticed. We dated for almost 2 years. They were genuinely good years. He showed up to the ribbon cutting for my second location and brought gas station flowers because he'd forgotten to plan, and somehow that made it better. He remembered that I hated cilantro, that I could recite entire scenes from old courtroom dramas, that my mother's birthday was in March. He told me I was the most quietly determined person he had ever met, and he said it like a compliment rather than a warning, which is what I chose to hear. We married in October 2021 at a venue in Sedona. 64 guests, sandstone and juniper, the red rocks catching the late afternoon light in a way that felt almost embarrassing in its beauty. The wedding cost $41,000. I paid for most of it. His contracting business had been slow that year. A dry spell, he said, was temporary, and I didn't make a thing of it because I believed him, and because it felt small against the larger picture. I had raised the subject of a prenuptial agreement once, in the spring before the wedding. I already had significant assets: the business, my retirement accounts, the equity in the condo I'd owned since 27. I raised it calmly, with a document my business attorney had already helped me draft. My husband went quiet for 2 days, and then his mother called me. His mother is a woman in her early 60s who has strong opinions about what a wife should be, and had never, in all the years I knew her, asked me a question about my business that wasn't framed as a polite criticism. She called to tell me that a prenup would make her son feel like I expected the marriage to fail, that if I truly trusted him, I wouldn't need a document to protect me from him. I dropped it. I was 31 and I was in love, and I wanted to believe that the right relationship doesn't require you to account for the worst case. That was my mistake, not the only one, but the one that made everything else possible. For the first 2 years of marriage, the arrangement felt balanced enough that I didn't examine it closely. He covered groceries sometimes, handled the yard, fixed things around the house that needed fixing, which was a genuine contribution. I want to be fair about that. But his contracting business ran inconsistently. A good quarter, then 2 slow ones. A big commercial job in early 2022 that fell through when the client pulled financing. By 2023, he was covering maybe 25% of our household expenses. The mortgage on the Scottsdale house was mine. The utilities were mine. The car insurance on his truck was mine, because we'd bundled the policies when we got married, and I'd never looked closely at who was actually paying what. I told myself it was temporary. He told me it was temporary, and I was busy enough, absorbed enough in the third location's growing pains and a staff hire that wasn't working out that I let the temporary stretch into something that stopped being temporary a long time ago. The shift happened in the fall of last year. I can't give you a single moment. It was more like a slow change in atmospheric pressure, the kind you notice in your joints before you notice in the sky. He started coming home later on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He bought a new pair of boots without mentioning them. He began keeping his phone screen angled away when he texted, a gesture so small and so automatic that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. I did not react immediately. I am not a reactive person. I watched. I kept a note in my phone. Dates, times, small inconsistencies. The weekend trip in November he called a fishing trip with his crew, where his truck's location on our shared family plan showed him in Sedona rather than the lake he'd named, the charge that appeared on the business card I had authorized. For him, he'd had access since early in the marriage, for Small's supply runs to the clinic when I needed someone to pick up tape or resistance bands while I was in with a patient. $212 at a restaurant I'd never heard of on a Thursday night. He said he was stuck on a job site. I noted it. I kept watching. In January, I called Douglas Keene. He was a family law attorney in Phoenix who had been recommended to me by my business attorney 3 years earlier, his number sitting in my contacts not because I'd planned anything, just because I have always believed in knowing your resources before you need them. I sat across from him on a Wednesday morning and told him what I had. He told me Arizona is a community property state, which typically means assets acquired during the marriage are split. But he also told me that what was brought into the marriage and what can be proven to have grown through documented individual is a different conversation entirely. "Do you have a prenuptial agreement?" he asked. I had to pause before answering. "No," I said. "I almost did." He nodded with the expression of a man who has heard that sentence 100 times. "Walk me through the business timeline." I did, for over an hour. When I left his office, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not dread, clarity. Cold, clean clarity like the air after a hard frost. I still went home that evening and made dinner and sat across from my husband at the kitchen table and watched him eat and listened to him talk about a bid he'd submitted, and I smiled in the right places. I was very good at it. I was beginning to understand I had been practicing it longer than I knew. The credit card statements arrived as PDF downloads to a new email address only I had access to. I printed them at the clinic after everyone left. I went through 18 months, line by line. The charges started in late September, a hotel in Sedona, not the fishing trip weekend earlier, a Wednesday through Thursday when he told me he had a commercial site walk in Flagstaff. One night, $189. A restaurant in November, $247. 2 movie tickets in December at a theater in a part of the city where neither of us had any reason to be. Another hotel in February, a resort property in Scottsdale, not far from our own neighborhood, which was a kind of audacity I found myself almost unable to process. 2 nights, $374. I made a spreadsheet. Over 6 months, my husband had spent $6,140 on someone else, using the supplementary card I paid off in full every month. Not because $6,000 was going to break anything. I want to be clear about that, but because of what it meant. He had looked at the card in his wallet, a card connected to the business I had built with my own hands and my own credit and 7 years of pre-dawn mornings. And he had decided it was just money, and money in this house came from me, so who was really going to notice? That was the moment something shifted in me. Not to anger. Anger is hot and it makes you sloppy. To something colder and more precise. The same feeling I get before a difficult negotiation or a meeting where the other side is coming in underestimating me. I called my accountant Arthur the next morning. He had been doing Renewal's annual audit for 5 years. Methodical, unhurried, the kind of man who has seen everything and been surprised by very little. I asked him to run a deeper review of the business card Julian had access to, going back 24 months, and any supply reimbursement requests submitted through our accounting portal under his name. He called me back 48 hours later. "Hazel," he said, and his voice had a careful quality I had not heard from him before, "I need you to sit down." The card charges Arthur couldn't categorize as legitimate clinic expenses totaled $19,400 over 14 months. Some were the same charges I'd already found. More were ones I hadn't looked at closely. A gym membership at a facility on the other side of the city, recurring monthly from October. A jewelry purchase in March for $1,340 at a store in Old Town Scottsdale. A flight to San Diego in April. 2 passengers, booked under a name that was not mine. He had put another woman on a plane using my business card. I was standing at the kitchen window when Arthur told me that. I pressed my palm flat against the glass and looked out at the saguaro we'd planted in the backyard when we moved in, which had just put out its first spring blooms. There was more, the reimbursement requests. My husband had been submitting them through our clinic portal for 16 months. Small amounts between $180 and $450, all with receipts attached, all for vendors that existed and were legitimate. But when Arthur cross-referenced the vendors against the card statements, 7 of those receipts covered expenses that had already been charged to the business card. He had been submitting for reimbursement on expenses already paid, pocketing the difference. Several $100s here, several hundred there, total $4,807 across 16 months. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think the silence around this part is its own kind of dishonesty. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I cried. Not the quiet, managed kind I'd allowed myself a few weeks earlier with the shower running. The kind that comes from somewhere below the rib cage. The kind your body does when it finally stops managing something and just lets the full weight of it arrive all at once. I cried for the Sedona wedding and the Red Rock Light and the 64 guests. I cried for the prenup I'd dropped because I didn't want a document that implied I expected the worst. I cried for the $41,000 ceremony and the mortgage in my name and the 7 years of early mornings and the $19,400 he had spent on someone he called Uncomplicated. I cried for the flight to San Diego, 2 passengers, on a card that existed because I had trusted him to pick up clinic supplies. I let myself do it for exactly as long as I was going to allow myself to do it. Then I stood up. I ran cold water over my face in the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. My eyes were red. I dried my face with a hand towel. I looked at the woman looking back at me. 32 years old, doctor of physical therapy, 3 clinic locations, a business worth $2.8 million built from a $15,000 loan, and a second-hand treatment table. And I thought about the girl in Tucson who had decided she was not going to live afraid of money. She hadn't. She had actually done that. And she was not going to let a man who bought someone else a plane ticket on her business card undo it. My husband came in around 7. He called down the stairs to ask if I wanted anything. I called back that I was on a work call and I was fine. He said okay and went back to whatever he was watching. I called Douglas the next morning. I told him about Arthur's findings. $24,000 in total between the card and the reimbursements. Douglas was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. The double billing on the reimbursements isn't just marital waste, he said. That's potential fraud against a business entity. That's a different legal category entirely. I know, I said. I want to have that conversation. He told me to come in Friday. Bring everything. I also called Tatum. We had been friends since our first year at U of A, had watched each other through job changes and health scares and the specific kind of loneliness that comes after a relationship that should have ended sooner. She was the one person who knew the whole arc of my life, not just the current chapter. I talked for nearly 20 minutes without stopping, and Tatum, who normally interrupts every 5 minutes, did not say a single word until I was finished. Then she said, "How long have you known?" "Since January, officially. Since October, when I started feeling something wrong." "Okay," she said, and then she said, "There's something I need to tell you, and I need you to hear that I've been going back and forth about it for a month." Her neighbor moved in the same general contracting circles my husband did. Bids, referrals, the small network of residential renovation work in a city this size. A few months back, the neighbor had mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd seen my husband at a restaurant with a woman he didn't recognize. Tatum hadn't said anything because she hadn't been sure what she was looking at. "What did she look like?" I asked. My voice was completely level. "Young," Tatum said, "dark hair, the kind of person who looks at ease everywhere." Uncomplicated, I thought. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday evening at 8:31 p.m. My mother-in-law's name came up on my screen, and I almost didn't answer. We spoke once a month at most, never in the evenings. I answered. Her voice was different from anything I had heard from her in 9 years of knowing her, not the careful, managed tone she used when she wanted to make a point about what kind of wife I was, something rawer. The voice of a woman who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally decided to set it down, regardless of what it damages on the way. "I owe you something," she said. "I've owed you something for a while." She told me her son had come to her in February and told her he was in love with someone named Layla, a woman he'd met through a mutual contact on a job site 8 months earlier. He told his mother he was planning to ask me for a divorce. He asked her not to say anything until he had the timing sorted out. She had kept that secret through a birthday dinner at our house where I'd made green chile stew and fresh tortillas from scratch while her son sat across from me, knowing exactly what he was planning. What broke her silence was a phone call from him that evening. He'd called to tell her his plan, she said. He was going to tell me this weekend. And then she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had a flatness to it that I recognized as the sound of someone reading from a very uncomfortable truth. He told me she's 10 weeks pregnant. The kitchen was very quiet around me. He needed things to move, quickly, she continued, and then she said the part that I think she had been most reluctant to deliver, the part that had finally made her pick up the phone. "He told me not to worry about the settlement," he said. Another pause. "He said you'd feel guilty about working so much, that you'd be reasonable." Those were his exact words. I looked out at the saguaro in the backyard. The spring blooms had closed for the evening. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. There was a long silence. "Because he asked me to move in with them after the divorce," she said very flatly. "He said he'd have enough from the settlement to rent something decent, and he wanted me close to help with the baby." She exhaled. "And I realized I had sat at your table and eaten food you bought and watched you build something real, and I had never once." She stopped. I couldn't do it. I thought about the prenup conversation. I thought about the call she had made to me 9 years ago explaining why I shouldn't need a document to protect myself from her son. "Thank you for telling me," I said, and I meant it completely. I called Douglas at 9:00 that night, He picked up on the second ring. "She's pregnant," I said. 10 weeks. He's planning to tell me this weekend. He told his mother I'll feel guilty enough to be reasonable. Douglas was quiet for 3 seconds. "Come in tomorrow morning at 8. Bring everything. We're filing Monday." The morning my husband came to tell me he had found something uncomplicated, I had been ready for 72 hours. He arrived at the clinic at 6:53 on a Saturday, which was exactly when I had expected him. I am, as I've said, very good at data, and I knew he would come to a place where I couldn't easily walk away. He sat in one of the waiting room chairs and put his hands on his knees and looked at me with the expression of a man who believes he is owed credit for being honest. He said we had grown apart. He said he had been unhappy for longer than he knew how to explain. He said there was someone. He used the word uncomplicated twice. He said he hoped we could handle this maturely. He said I deserved the truth. He did not mention Layla's name. He did not mention the pregnancy. He did not mention the $24,270 in business card charges and fraudulent reimbursements. He did not mention that he had told his mother I would be reasonable because I would feel guilty about working too much. I let him finish, and then I smiled, not performed, genuinely, because what I felt in that moment was something very close to relief. The pretending was over, for both of us, actually. "I appreciate you telling me," I said. "Excuse me for just a minute." I walked back to my desk. I called Kendall. "Cancel his portal access right now," I said, "and call Douglas. Tell him it's Saturday." Then I walked back out, and I stood across from my husband in the waiting room of the clinic I had built, and I said, "I've been meeting with Douglas Keene since January. I have Arthur's full forensic report on the business card. $19,400 in personal charges over 14 months, including a round-trip flight to San Diego for 2 people in April. I have the reimbursement records. 11 requests over 16 months, 7 of which were double billed against charges already on the business card, another $4,870. I have location data going back to October. And I have a conversation your mother had with me Thursday night about Layla and the pregnancy and the fact that you told her I would feel guilty enough to be reasonable." The color left his face very fast. It was almost interesting to watch. "Douglas is filing Monday. The locks at the house will be changed by noon today. It's in my name, on my credit. Your card access to the business system was canceled 4 minutes ago. And your mother's prescription auto pay, which I have been covering, I'm going to keep covering it because she is a 63-year-old woman with a cardiac condition and none of this is her fault." I picked up my coffee, still cold. "You should probably find an attorney," I said, "a real one." He opened his mouth. I said, very quietly, "I've thought about what I want to say to you, and there's only one thing worth saying. You looked at everything I built, and you saw a resource. You saw someone too busy and too trusting to look closely. You mistook my generosity for inattention and my work ethic for guilt. Those are not the same things. And you were wrong about the last part." He left the clinic without answering. His truck was gone from the house by 3 that afternoon. The locksmith came at noon, and I stood on the front porch in the desert air and watched the new hardware go in and felt the particular spaciousness of a house that has just become entirely yours again. The divorce took 7 months. Arizona's a community property state, but documented financial misconduct changes the shape of a negotiation in ways my husband had apparently not factored in when he told his mother not to worry. Submitting fraudulent reimbursements against a business entity is not a civil matter that disappears in a settlement. Douglas explained those implications to my husband's attorney in precise and unhurried terms. He got a fraction of what he had imagined. He received $34,000 from the house equity. His contribution to the mortgage across 18 months, calculated to the dollar, structured as a 20-month buyout reduced by the documented fraud amount. He got his personal belongings, his tools, his truck under its own lease. He got nothing from renewal physical therapy, which Douglas argued successfully was a substantially premarital asset whose growth was traceable exclusively to my documented individual effort and decision-making. He did not get the furniture. He did not get the kitchen table. Layla's baby, a girl I heard later through someone who knew someone, was born in August. I hope that child has a fine life. None of this was her doing. My mother-in-law called once during the proceedings to ask whether I had stopped her prescription payments. I told her I had put a brief hold and then quietly reinstated them because whatever her son was, she was a 63-year-old woman with a cardiac history, and I was not built to punish people for someone else's choices. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "You were always too good for him." I said thank you, and we have not spoken since, and I think that is the appropriate distance. Renewal Physical Therapy is doing well. We signed a lease on a 4th location in Mesa this spring. I promoted Kendall to Operations Director, a title she had been performing for 2 years without the salary to match, and I will not let that kind of imbalance sit uncorrected again. She runs the existing 3 locations with a calm precision I recognize because I built it, and I am proud of her every single day. I sold the Scottsdale house in October. Got $689,000 for it, more than we'd paid, because of the renovations and the market and the fact that I had maintained it like something worth protecting. I bought a smaller place in Tempe, close to the original clinic. It has a good kitchen and a backyard where I've already started planning what to plant in spring. Tatum came over the first weekend I was in the new place. We sat on the floor of the empty living room because I hadn't bought furniture yet, and she brought 2 bags of the good coffee, and we made it in the only pot I'd unpacked and drank it out of paper cups and talked until almost midnight. It was one of the best nights I'd had in years. I think about the girl in Tucson sometimes. The one who watched her parents work their whole lives for something solid and decided she was going to build that solidity herself. She did it. She actually did it. And it turned out the fear was never really about money. It was about believing that other people's comfort was hers to maintain, at the cost of her own clarity. She doesn't believe that anymore. I am 33 years old. I run a business I built from nothing. My credit score is 798. My name is on 4 commercial leases, a residential mortgage I own outright, and a dozen decisions I have never once regretted. I drink my coffee standing at the kitchen window of my own house in the early morning, and I watch whatever the day looks like outside. My husband called once, about 5 months after everything was final. I don't know what he wanted to say. I let it go to voicemail. I deleted it the same evening, cleanly, without ceremony, the way you delete something that no longer has any claim on your time. Some doors you don't need to open twice. You just need to know, with the absolute certainty of someone who has always been the most prepared person in any room she walks into, that you were the one who chose to close it.